Well, you're watching World Talks on DVB World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. On Red Square's symbolism outweighed hardware as Russia marked Victory Day without its traditional display of heavy military equipment, amid drone-related security concerns and a war entering its fifth year. Vladimir Putin used the occasion to cast the invasion of Ukraine as a broader confrontation with NATO, while foreign allies including Belarus, Kazakhstan and North Korea appeared within the tightly managed optics of the event. We speak now about the event itself with Andreas Umland, Policy Fellow, European Policy Institute in Kyiv. Good to have you with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me again.
Okay, so this parade has now concluded. I want to just get your sense, your takeaways of what we saw, what we didn't see, a scaled-down parade, much less hardware. What's your main, let's say, observation after all this?
I think the context and the prehistory and this funny decree by the Ukrainian president who allowed Russia to conduct its parade in Moscow. I mean, this is all, I would say, humiliating for Putin against the background that this was all supposed to be a short special military operation as it was presented in 2022, and it's now turning into an embarrassment and also symbolized by the few foreign guests present there and the overall minor scale of this event, although it's of course the major official event of the year.
Mm-hmm. Now, again, I think optics is really important here. It was important for Vladimir Putin. This is something that he wanted to make sure that it was safe. We were talking about the ceasefire. We weren't sure it was going to get one or not. It seems to have been gotten because of Trump's intervention. But I want to get to that first, the optics of this. I mean, we know this, looking at it from the West, but how do Russians perceive this? I mean, this is scaled down, almost no foreign leaders. How do Russians, ordinary Russians, look at this? Will they see this as weakness of President Putin?
That's a good question. I also wonder how people will react to this, because in comparison to earlier such events, this is of course very different. And last year is maybe not entirely comparable because it was a round year, and this year is a more common year, but still it's not comparable to earlier such events. Maybe some Russians will think as this being adequate, but I could also imagine that many, especially of the sort of more imperially, nationalistically minded Russians, do not find this particularly reassuring to have such a minor, very ordinary, you could say, parade that are also conducted in this form by Western countries and they do not like anymore anymore like a special Russian event, although the Russian victory as it's perceived in Russia was of course a very special one, uncomparable to any other victories in world history.
Mm-hmm. And then also, I mean, looking at the participation, I know that we could see North Korean troops also on Red Square parading with Russian units as well. I mean, we know that the North Koreans were also involved in failed attempts also to use them with Russians, also on the Western theater, also into Ukraine there, protecting Russia. They took heavy losses. So what about that significance? What does that tell us? I mean, in terms of all the allies that are present, it's the North Koreans there. Any significance of them being present?
Yes, and my impression or my suggestion or speculation would be that perhaps this presence is not something that Russians will perceive as particularly reassuring. I think even within Russia, North Korea has not the best of reputations, and to have now this country as an ally will not impress people in Russia, and of course even less so outside Russia.
Mm-hmm. And also the nature of the ceasefire, like I said, this was something President Trump announced on Friday. He said this would be accepted by both Ukraine and Russia. Get your sense of, what that does. I mean, the optics could be one way that Putin had to ask for this from Trump. How will this also going forward now change the dynamic with peace talks, maybe in future? Will Trump now be more accommodating to the Ukrainians?
I'm not so sure what Trump's role here in further will be, but for the Ukrainians, the win in this situation was the prisoners exchange, and that still has to happen, but it's expected that it will happen as it was announced, and that is a very high priority in Ukraine. There's also a lot of pressure, one should say, on the Ukrainian government to get more Ukrainians out of Russian presence, whether prisoners of war or civilian prisoners. There are more than 15,000 civilians also in Ukrainian civilians in Russian prisons, and all these families, they want their fathers, brothers. They're mostly men, but not only men. There are also very a significant amount of women among them. They want their relatives back, and I guess this is why Zelensky agreed to this deal.
Mm-hmm. And then also back to the talks as well. I mean, we know that this is all very unstable at the moment, but we know that there were some kind of discussions happening in Washington, in the United States, between the Americans and potentially the Russians. Where are we this moving in terms of potentially going back to any sort of trilateral? I mean, we're far away from that, but do you see any hope for more diplomacy looking ahead in the next few weeks and months?
I wouldn't say in the next few weeks, but perhaps in the next few months, if the current pressure on the Russian economy continues. There is now the combined pressure of the sanctions and of the Ukrainian kinetic sanctions, if you want to call them this way, on the Russian economy, and we get more and more news from about social and economic problems in Russia. And if that trend continues for another few months, I could imagine that then actually the talks about a ceasefire may make sense, because Russia may have no other choice than to look for a truce in order to restore its economy and to get the ports running again and the pipelines and so on. So this is now, I think, moving in the right direction, but we are not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Andreas, you mentioned the ports and the pipelines. Let's widen that out also to refineries. I mean, the Ukrainians have been striking deep into Russian territory from various directions, really damaging exactly those critical arteries of refining that's important for Putin's war machine. If this continues, I mean, the Russians will likely never admit it, but how damaging, how much will that force them to change course?
Yes, I think that's the only possibility, and at least in the economic sphere, to come to an end of the war. What is also important is, of course, what's happening on the front line, and we are now, I think, closer to serious negotiations. I think so far it was largely a negotiation theater made for Trump, and perhaps it will also continue in that way if negotiations are happening again for another few months. But the current trend is clearly negative for Russia. And if that trend continues, then eventually we may actually see some sort of negotiations that make sense. Although one still wonders whether really there's a chance for a negotiated end to this war. My colleague Gustav Gressel from Vienna has just published on our website at the European Policy Institute in Kyiv a commentary where he says it's unlikely that there will be a negotiated end to this war. It's either going to be a Russian victory or a Ukrainian victory, because the stakes are very high on both sides, and therefore maybe these negotiations will not actually make that much of an impact.
But I have to ask them directly, I'm curious now, what does that then mean and look like? What does a Russian or a Ukrainian victory look like if it's not negotiated?
Well, a Russian victory is obviously some sort of some sort of territorial gain or even a political victory in Kyiv. That means Russia is looking for more territory. It wants, for instance, the northern Donbas that it hasn't managed for 12 years already to capture. It wants it to be given by Ukraine, or obviously the end goal of Russia is a changeover of the regime in Kyiv and de facto control, Russian control over Ukraine. For Ukraine, the major point of the defensive war that it's conducting is the restoration of the territorial integrity of Ukraine and the return of the occupied territories. Perhaps something less could also already count as a victory. Let's say a return to the borders, or not to the borders, but to the front or contact line of 2021. Something like that would also count already for Ukraine as a victory.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, it's interesting you said victory and success on the battlefield. I think it's also Kyiv claiming recently 480 square kilometers and 12 settlements regained near the Alexandrovsk axis there. So interesting point there. We'll see how that goes. Looking also at May 9th, I mean, this is something that Russia touts as its own victory day over Nazi Germany. It's also Europe Day for many of us across the European Union, even for those who are in the bloc and not yet. Robert Fico, the only European leader actually in Moscow, although he didn't attend the parade. What do we make of that now? I mean, these two kind of ideas don't necessarily complement each other, but what do you think of Europe Day today, its significance for the rest of Europe?
In a way, one could argue that these memorial dates, they are symbolizing what this entire conflict is about, because remember that the Euromaidan in 2013 started at the occasion of the delay of Ukraine's European integration through Yanukovych's decision to not sign the association agreement with Ukraine, which then triggered the protests in Kyiv, and the weakness in which Ukraine then appeared in February 2014 was then the motivation, I guess, for Russia to take this moment, to take advantage of this moment, and to start a war with the occupation and then annexation of Crimea. So these two dates, different memories, are closely linked to each other. And for Russia, of course, this entire war against Ukraine is a strange kind of continuation of World War II. And the whole talk about Ukraine with the president somehow is one of the major justifications, at least vis-a-vis the Russian population, of Putin's war against Ukraine. Although I guess many Russians actually do believe also this narrative, unfortunately.
Yeah, indeed. And also one country in particular will also be celebrating Europe Day. Will be Hungary. I mean, a major day there today with Peter Magyar being sworn in. That's also something we'll be covering here. Look, thanks so much for all that. Always a pleasure having you on. Andreas Umland there, Policy Fellow, European Policy Institute in Kyiv. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us here on World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more. Goodbye.